Lavender Literary Society members, good evening and welcome to our fifth edition of the American LGBTQ plus Museums Book Club and the second title for our 2024 fall season, The Women's House of Detention. Today we continue our voyage through the vivid landscapes of queer culture, guided by the vibrant pages of the books we'll spend time with over the course of the months ahead. As we gather in this virtual space, we are not merely readers, but trailblazers, forging connections that transcend time and generations. Our mission is clear: to honor our history, celebrate our present, and pave the way for a future steeped in understanding and unity. Within the covers of our chosen books, we will discover more than stories. We will uncover the essence of resilience, the beauty of diversity, and the power of solidarity. With each turn of the page, we become architects of change, weaving our experiences into a tapestry of strength and pride. But this book club is more than just words on a page. It is a movement, a force of empowerment, and a testament to the indomitable spirit of the LGBTQ plus community. Together, we will traverse the rich terrain of queer history, fiction, and memoir, guided by inspiring authors and iconic guest facilitators. So let us not only read, but immerse ourselves in the magic of storytelling as we journey through the narratives that define us, inspire us, and connect us. For in this space, our voices are heard, our stories are celebrated, and our collective spirit shines brightly. Welcome to the American LGBTQ Plus Museum Book Club, where every page turned is a step forward in our shared quest for understanding, empathy, pride, and queer liberation. My name is Suhaili Bautista Carolina, and I am the Director of Public Programs and Partnerships at the American LGBTQ Plus Museum. I am a brown-skinned woman. I'm wearing multiple rings on my hands. I'm wearing hoop golden earrings, and I have a curly afro hairstyle. The American LGBTQ Plus Museum is a new collaboration dedicated to preserving, researching, and sharing LGBTQ plus history and culture that will open its first galleries in New York City in 2027. However, we like to say that you do not have to wait until 2027 to experience the queer magic of the American LGBTQ plus Museum. In fact, you're experiencing it right now. We're already producing and presenting dynamic public programming as well as traveling exhibitions centered on LGBTQ plus history and culture. And I encourage you to subscribe to our monthly newsletter, follow us on social media, become a founding member, and attend a program. Stay engaged as our story continues to unfold. Before we begin, I'd like to share our virtual land acknowledgement. While we are gathered in a virtual space today, we are each tuning in from our respective Indigenous lands. I myself am joining you from present-day New York City, the unceded homeland of the Lenape people. We respect the diverse Indigenous peoples connected to the territories on which we reside and gather, and honor the energy and stewardship of these lands by all Indigenous generations, past, present, and future. Now it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's author, Hugh Ryan. Hugh Ryan is a writer, historian, and curator whose first book, When Brooklyn Was Queer, received the New York City Book Award from the Society Library. Tonight, he'll be discussing his most recent book, The Women's House of Detention, A Queer History of a Forgotten Prison. And we're so happy to welcome our host, Jay Edidin. Jay Edidin is the Director of Advocacy and LGBTQIA+ initiatives at the Women's Community Justice Association. Without further ado, I welcome Hugh and Jay to the virtual stage.
Thank you, Sally, and thank you, Jay, and thank you to everyone who's here and to the American LGBTQ Museum for hosting us. My name is Hugh Ryan. I'm a historian. I have brown short hair, a brown beard, glasses, a gray hoodie, and a bit of a twitch on my left-hand side. So if you see my eye winking at you, that's what's going on. And I'm so excited to be here in conversation with Jay.
Likewise, so I'm Jay Edidin. I'm a white man in my early 40s with a short beard, brown hair and glasses, and I'm wearing a black t-shirt, a rainbow cap, and silver headphones. And Hugh, why don't you start with sort of an intro to the book and reading a bit of it and sort of throw people in? I'm not sure how many folks who are here who've read the book already, but for those who haven't, I think this will be a good introduction, and for those who have, a good refresher.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm going to read from a couple of pages of the introduction. I'm not going to read for too long, so you will get to hear me read the first like 5 or so pages. The book itself is called The Women's House of Detention, which is also the name of the infamous prison/jail complex that stood in Greenwich Village for most of the 20th century. I started writing this book actually while I was finishing up my last book, When Brooklyn Was Queer, though I didn't realize I was writing it. I was just following the stories of some of the individuals who you'll meet over the pages of the book. In particular, one, Jay Toole, who is a kind of living legend, activist, speaker, and tour leader who led me on a tour of Greenwich Village. That's part of how I got to know this story. So, the introduction is called Jay Toole Marks the Land. The Jefferson Market Garden in Greenwich Village is one of the loveliest places I can't stand. Flowering season seems to last longer there than the rest of the city. The low-rise nature of the surrounding buildings allows precious sun to warm the garden in for Lenten roses in the first weeks of March, and keeps the ground inviting until the last camellias drop their petals in November. The only potential reminder of the spot's 150-year history as a prison is the high steel fence, which these days keeps the unwanted riffraff out rather than in. I used to love this garden. I'd sit by the koi pond, do interviews on my cell phone, and think what a beautiful oasis it was. What a gift the village had given the city. Now, I can't look at it without hearing Jay Toole's voice describing the brutal physicals the doctors had inflicted upon her there, when the garden was a prison called the Women's House of Detention. When I go into the garden, I'm always brought back to the one time. It happened many, many times, but this one stands out. He's telling me to get on the table, put my feet in the stirrups, and this and that, and it felt like his whole arm went in there, you know? And they checked everywhere. Every hole you have, that's where they went. Then he was like, all right, get off the table, hurry up. We got to bring the next one in. Hurry up? I couldn't move. The pain was so bad, and I don't know what he did up there, but it was so, so bad. When I looked down, I was covered in blood, and they didn't do nothing. Today, it's hard to imagine that a prison once graced the rarefied streets of Greenwich Village, one of New York City's most picturesque and unaffordable neighborhoods. But for almost as long as there has been a Greenwich Village, which is to say, almost as long as there has been a United States, detention centers have been an integral part of village life. The last of them, the Women's House of Detention, stood from 1929 to 1974. It was one of the village's most famous landmarks, a meeting place for locals and a must-see sight for adventurous tourists. And for tens of thousands of arrested women and trans-masculine people from every corner of the city, the House of D was a nexus, drawing the threads of their lives together in its dark and fearsome cells. Some were imprisoned there once, for as little as a day. Others returned often and were held for years at a time. For decades, upon their release, these women navigated the streets of Greenwich Village, ate in its automats and diners, caroused in the bars that would let them in, lived in nearby tenements, slept rough in the parks, visited friends and loved ones who were on trial or in detention, worked what jobs would hire them, attended court-mandated health screenings and probation meetings, and in a million and one other ways, made the village their own. Now, aside from a small plaque on the garden's fence, they have been almost entirely forgotten. Almost. The slim few who have fought to preserve the memory of the House of D are mostly working-class lesbian and bisexual women and trans-masculine folks, the people most likely to fall into its clutches, and least likely to have other landmarks to call their own. Jay Toole first ended up in the orbit of the House of D when she was 13 in 1960. Some friends had given her the haircut every cool boy wanted, a tight fade flat top, just like Steve McQueen and Mickey Mantle. That was the final straw for her father, a violent, sexually abusive man who ruled their Bronx home with his fists. That night he threw her out, and Jay lived among the queer kids on the streets for the village for the next 25 years. At the age when most of her peers started high school, Jay started heroin. In 1964, she stole a taxi to drive her girlfriend to California, but they only made it as far as Texas before they were caught, and Jay was sentenced to her first bid in the House of D. A lot of us called it the playground. A lot of us called it a prison. I called it both, Jay told historians in 2016, depending on what I was arrested for and how much I got. For Jay, the prison was complicated, dangerous, vile, violent, dirty, cruel, but also a place where she met other queer people and one of the centers of her queer community. She and other butches would hang out in the shadow of the prison at Wayland's drugstore on 6th Avenue, where they could watch the tide of arrested women flow in and out of the prison's high stone walls. Most of the people she met in there are gone now, dead or disappeared. But Jay keeps their memories alive. Since the early 2000s, she's organized tours of the West Village to share the queer history of the House of D because young people don't know about it. The landmark is gone, but she marks the land, exposing the grim roots beneath the garden's manicured paths. Make no mistake, the House of D was a queer landmark. In truth, all prisons are, especially ones intended for women. Today, approximately 40% of people incarcerated in women's detention centers are part of the broad LGBTQ spectrum. 40%. That's compared to about 3.5% of the general population. That percentage is based on in-person interviews with over 100,000 currently detained people. And researchers only identified someone as a, quote, sexual minority if they themselves identified that way in the interview, or if they had sexual relationships with people of the same sex before being incarcerated. We can only speculate how high the percentage would have been had the study counted those who could not talk openly about their sexual identities, or if it included those who had sexual relationships with other women while incarcerated. We live in the age of mass incarceration. If we extrapolate those findings to the nearly 250,000 women currently incarcerated in America, at least 100,000 are queer. And that's after decades of LGBTQ, feminist, anti-racist, and anti-prison activism, which have supposedly made our criminal legal system more fair. During the years the House of D was active, which spanned the single most homophobic period in American history, the percentage of queer people it encaged was almost certainly higher. How much higher we'll never know for sure. But records show that queer women and trans masculine people were sentenced to the House of D for such crimes as smoking, forgery, petty larceny, being homeless, attempting suicide, murder, wearing pants, sending the definition of the word lesbian through the mail, associating with idle or vicious persons, staying out late, accepting a ride from a man, vagrancy, alcoholism, prostitution, possession of narcotics, waywardism, disobedience, stealing rare books, being alone on the street, rape, drug addiction, and lesbianism itself. Yet the impacts of queer people on prison history and the impacts of prisons on queer history are rarely examined. And even when they are, the focus is mostly on men. I'm going to stop there. I go on through the rest of the introduction to talk more about the House of D and tell us more about Jay Toole's life. Jay emerges as a real major character throughout that introduction. I don't like leaving a reading from the introduction without telling you what happens with Jay, because Jay goes on to become a leader in the queer unhoused movement, in the economic rights movement, in the justice movement here in New York. And through that leadership really moves things forward for the same people who she herself was in community with when she was first arrested as a 13-year-old. So that's just kind of a cap off on the introduction. And now I will turn it over to Jay.
So my first question is one that you touched on in the introduction, in the part that you read, but that you develop more later, and that I want to hear you talk about even still further. So a little bit later in the introduction, you write that some of our oldest and most extensive records of queer history come from our carceral system, and also that the histories of incarceration and queer life in America are inextricably entangled. Um, Aside from just the statistical information you just gave, can you talk more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. This comes down to what I think about a lot, which is there are two ways you enter public records, right? Either you are the kind of person who is rich and powerful and you get interviewed and you publish a book and you own your own home, so you pass your diaries down to your children and they're not embarrassed by you, so they donate them to an archive. And in all these ways, I can find information about people who had power. That was not going to happen for most of the people in the Women's House of Detention. And in fact, for most queer people throughout history, they have not held power. And if they are out or have been outed, generally, not just in our modern terms, but in the ways they might have thought about themselves, if they've gotten in trouble with the law, those kinds of power and memory are rarely given to us. The rest of us, enter into the public record based as someone else's raw information for something that they're doing. So journalists are the obvious answer, right? They interview people, those people end up in newspapers. But there are vast amounts of information that come from the American administrative state, right? Our police, in particular, our prisons, they keep extensive records of the people who are seen as bad, wrong, enemies of the state, arrestable. Queer people in general fall into this category and have historically, for lots of reasons that we can get into, but often these are the only records you can find about queer people, particularly queer people who are working class, people of color, people who are trans, folks who do not have a lot of access to other kinds of power. But the problem is that these records see those people through the eyes of their profession. The entire reason the record exists, right? They see, in the case of police and prison records, they see everyone who comes into their orbit as a criminal, right? And that's the only thing they're interested in. And they already predispose them in keeping these records. So when I say these records are some of our most common, well, that's because we were being arrested a lot. But they're also really bad because the information they keep is not very useful for us. It's prejudiced and biased. It's often being taken by people who are themselves not very well educated about queer things. And although a lot of police are overpaid, the folks who keep these kinds of records and who archive them are not. And often they're not very well trained either. And so the records themselves are not very well made. And if you look into our prison and policing history, about every 20, 30 years or so, we look backwards and say, oh my God, everything we were doing was awful and evil, and we should never let anyone know that happened. And so the records are frequently destroyed. So in that sense, it's this weird balance, right? We have these records of arrests and incarceration for things like sodomy, which doesn't quite mean what we think of it as today, but did capture queer people going back, to the 1600s. We have court cases in, New Amsterdam, but they don't tell us very useful information most of the time.
So another point of the intersection of the carceral system and the queer community applies fairly specific to women in your book, and specifically the use of the carceral system really from its beginnings in New York to police appropriate performance of femininity. Can you elaborate some on that?
Yeah, so this one I'm going to give a kind of a long answer. So please, Jay, jump in and kind of redirect me if you need to, or remind me where we're going. I'm going to go back actually to the Civil War. Because pre-Civil War, we don't have any standalone prisons for women. There are some institutions that have incarceration wings for women, but most women were their experiences of detention, punishment, incarceration, all of that kind of stuff were handled in the family. If you were white and upper class, it was your birth family and then eventually your husband's family. If you were a person of color, it might be the family that enslaved you. Or if you were an indentured servant of any kind, it was the family you were employed by, it was your husband. If you were old enough, it was your male children. In all of these cases, it was inside the family that you were disciplined and punished. Then the Civil War happens. After the Civil War, we see women of all kind taking up a much bigger space in the public sphere. So after the Civil War is the first time, for instance, that the census asks about women's employment outside of the house. And obviously, after the Civil War, there are increasing numbers of free Black women who are enabled to live the kind of public lives that get you arrested. So we start to see the first prisons for women develop in America in the 1870s, 1880s time period. And these prisons have a very specific idea of what they're doing. They understand that there are only three jobs that a woman can have in this world, right? A good woman can be a wife or a mother, and a bad woman can be a prostitute. And that's it. So if you are not able to be a wife or mother, if you're not able to be a maid and kind of take on those duties for pay, whether that's a nursemaid or a chambermaid or a maid of the house, if you are not appropriately feminine enough to take on these roles, well, inevitably, you're going to end up on the streets. When you're on the streets, you're going to end up a prostitute. And so the system saw that what they were really looking at was femininity. Women who were improperly feminine, whether because they were too masculine, too educated, too sexual, too determined, in any of these ways, were going to end up on the streets where, according to the system, they would be prostitutes, which would inevitably spread disease, have the wrong kind of children, all of these negatives for the community. And so we start to develop in the 1870s and 1880s a system of incarceration for women that is determined to arrest them at younger ages for less serious charges and incarcerate them for longer periods of time, because what they need to do, men are punished by being put into prison, but women are trained. Women are brought into the system to make them proper. It's a very different understanding of what the system is supposed to do. And we have this in print. The first jail for women, first prison to open up for women, said in their annual report that their job was to train these women to occupy the position given them by God, wives, mothers, and the educators of children. Right? And they don't mean teachers by that, they mean nursemaids. This is what the system saw itself as doing. And so it, of course, focused on women who are improperly feminine through the eyes of white Victorians, because those are the people making the system. So we get this system of women's incarceration starting in the 1870s and going up until today. But at the very least, in a written way, up through about the 1940s, World War II, where we start to move away from some of this talk of that being the purpose. But even as late as the mid 1940s, you can find all of these writings about incarcerated women that say the number one thing to fix an arrested woman is to get her into a good marriage and have children. The two are just sort of inextricably linked in the eyes of the law. And for that reason, most of the incarceration that we see in the early records is around prostitution. And that's why a lot of this has been hidden from the eyes of queer historians for a long time. Surface level prostitution charge kind of indicates some degree of interaction with heterosexuality or sex with men. It certainly doesn't say, oh, this is a queer woman who is not feminine enough. But that's how the charge gets used, because an unfeminine woman is inevitably a prostitute.
Yeah, I was actually that's my follow-up question because you talked about it sounds like from the book that the charge of prostitution was pretty much leveled for being female in public at the wrong place at the wrong time or with the wrong presentation or and
Absolutely.
the degree of entrapment that went around it seems well it
Yeah.
seems I guess less wild than it would in a city that didn't have the NYPD, but
Yeah, we haven't
um
learned a lot, but it's
yeah.
so true that these charges. I mean, in New York City case law, it says prostitution is simply the common lewdness of woman at this time. That there is no exchange of sex for money that is necessary for a prostitution charge. Prostitution is a misdemeanor. It requires no evidence other than the word of the arresting police officer. Because it is a misdemeanor, the women have no right to a lawyer. There's almost no recourse for them. It's a charge that hides everything and then destroys all the evidence.
So looking at that and looking specifically at the idea of reformation and that reformation involves compulsory heterosexuality, how did that ideology translate into the organizations that were dealing with reentry? You talk a lot about the Women's Prison Association and some other folks, and they seem to have had a more liberal but still very, very socially informed perspective on what kind of lives the women and transmasculine people coming out of the House of D ought to lead.
Yeah, yeah, they did, and it's a complicated and it's a changing perspective over the course of this story. In the earliest parts of this time, in the 1870s, 80s, 90s, this is before the House of Detention opened, which is about 1929-31, and the Women's Court opens first. That's 1910. Even before that, though, we do have people who are starting to work with folks who are returning to their communities from these institutions. In the early years, many of these women reformers, social workers, journalists, politicians, they were themselves looked at as being improperly feminine, right? Just their desire to have this kind of job and do this kind of work, even if they justified it by saying it's a religious calling, God tells me I have to help other women, it's still this kind of public life, public employment that makes people look a little askance at them. So by the time the social work files that I used, as you mentioned from the Women's Prison Association, come along, there are a number of the social workers who, yes, understand that the system they are in requires them to have these women arrested or to follow up with them because they're on probation and things like that. But they already are coming in with an eye that the system itself is also wrong, right? They have some sense, some of them, not all of them. Others are coming in and are themselves queer, right? A lot of the folks who are coming into these early social work organizations are lesbians, are bisexual women, are non in our modern terms non-binary and transmasculine folks. So there are some of those people in these files too. However, as time goes on, we see fewer and fewer of those kinds of social workers, the ones who are coming in and it's almost an inappropriate job for them to have. The pink collar revolution kind of takes over and these jobs get coded as appropriately feminine. And as the job itself becomes appropriately feminine, the people who are in those jobs start to take a harder and worse line against their own clients, right? So by the time we get up into the 1960s, the social work files that I use for the 30s, 40s, and 50s, which are really useful back then, become less and less effective because the women in these jobs are themselves now separated from the folks that they're working with in a way that they weren't always before this. And so we start to see a lot of files that are closed with just the words, she is a lesbian, inappropriate for services, right? We stop seeing this kind of empathizing, this kind of hopefully attempts at understanding. There are these kind of problematic, homophobic, queerphobic, racist social workers going back, earlier in the history too. Uh, Many of them are folks who have never encountered a queer person in their own personal lives, and they kind of have this 19th century education around what sexuality and gender identity is. So often the most homophobic and transphobic of the social workers are also the ones who are saying things in these records that sound craziest to us because they're not 20th century ideas. These are people who are receiving 19th century ideas in their education and then sort of like half passing them on to people in the 1950s and 60s for whom these ideas are ridiculous and make no sense.
So you're talking about the WPA files, brings me to something I'm really curious about, which is what the process of researching this book was like. You mentioned sort of cycles of records being destroyed and lost, and you've obviously found a good many and were able to track down a remarkable number of primary sources, and interview subjects as well. How did you go into this? What did you find? What was out there, and where are the holes? What's missing?
That is a great question because I will tell you the first year of research on this, I did not think I was going to be able to tell this story. I, in fact, thought that's why no one has told this story because I could not find almost anything. And I'd already written another book of queer New York City history called When Brooklyn Was Queer. That book was a process of asking a million people the same question over and over again. Do you know anything about Brooklyn's queer history? And it can be truly anything. And I went to so many different archives and so many different places because a lot of people had thought about Brooklyn, but not through a queer lens. And a lot of people had thought about queerness, but not through a Brooklyn lens. And I was kind of bringing all of these things together. I thought the process of researching the House of D would be similar. And it really wasn't. When I started, I asked all the same people and got very little information. Most folks said they knew it existed. Maybe they had walked by and had seen people yelling up to folks who were incarcerated, but that was kind of it. Even folks in the know in queer life were pretty separated from the community that formed around the prison. Then I started looking at all the magazines and newsletters that were made, anything related to queer stuff, feminist stuff, socialist stuff, going back into the 1940s. Very little there too, up until the late 1960s, early 70s, where there start to be some feminist, particularly black feminist publications that pay a little bit of attention, but really nothing earlier. I looked at the correspondence of famous queer people. They would occasionally mention prison issues, but if they did, it was almost always about cis men or maybe folks who might have identified as trans women but were being arrested as drag queens. Very, very little about cis women and trans men. And so I thought, well, you know what? Actually, maybe I can't write this book. Maybe the only records that exist are the ones taken by the police in the prisons. And like I said, those are bad. I did not want to write a book from those perspectives. They were not going to give us the answers that we needed. So I stopped, actually, and I took a pause. And I started to ask myself, how did other historians do this, right? How did they deal with work that seemed insurmountable because they did not know if the archive existed? And that naturally led me to Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, and the work of Sadia Hartman. Sadia Hartman is a brilliant historian. She has written fabulously on so many different topics. Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments covers some of the same queer folks that I write about in The House of D and in When Brooklyn Was Queer. And she talks in an earlier work about what she calls a process of critical fabulation. I believe the context for this is that she was writing about women who had been kidnapped in Africa to be sold into slavery in America, but died during the transatlantic passage. So very little, almost nothing is known about these people. Yet, when we as historians cannot write someone as a fully fledged character with a life, with a body, with experiences, it's very hard to get popular audiences to latch onto them. They're forgettable, right? We're creating a hole in our own history. And so she uses the process of critical fabulation, doing the critical part, doing a ton of research, really knowing the world that she's imagining into, and then fabulizing it, right? Making us see what might have happened, what probably happened. I knew I couldn't do that for this project for a lot of reasons, but primarily because I could not imagine a world in which I could fabulate myself, no matter how much I read or researched, into the lives of these people in a way that would be helpful or good as history. But what I could do is I could use critical fabulation to imagine the lives of the women and transmasculine people who I was pretty certain had been arrested and incarcerated in the House of D over the decades. And if I could imagine their lives, if I could sort of see them on a timeline in my head, almost like a film script of them, I could start to look for those places where their lives intersected with the kind of power that I mentioned earlier that would get you caught up in public history and in records. And almost as soon as I had that thought, I knew where I needed to go. Because my first job in New York City was social work adjacent. I was a youth worker with homeless queer youth in New York City. And I knew the kinds of records we kept. And our social workers kept these voluminous, robust records that had everything in them, from letters from parents to diaries the kids left behind and never came to collect, to school photos, to medical records, to letters they wrote us, to love notes they passed between each other. If files like that existed about the folks who had been incarcerated in the House of D, I knew they would have the kind of information I needed. But I just had to find them first. And lo and behold, I looked at the New York Public Library because the New York Public Library is the best institution in the city. And if you're doing any kind of research, you should always start there. And they had a collection called the Women's Prison Association Case Files. The Women's Prison Association was the first organization in America working with formerly incarcerated women, split off from an even older organization in the mid 1800s. And they had been doing casework out of a place called the Hopper Home on 2nd Avenue ever since. They were still open. When I started writing this book, they're still open today. They're still doing this work. And so in I think about 80, 81, they gave something like 150 boxes of their case files to the New York Public Library. But this is a particularly rough moment in New York City history. So what happened was this. They go to give the boxes, and they say to the library very sensibly, if a file in these boxes is less than 75 years old, don't let anyone see it without specific permission from us, because they didn't want anyone who was still alive to have their business shared inappropriately. The library said, that sounds great. Only when the boxes arrived, they weren't in chronological order. They were in alphabetical order. And the library looked at them and said, well, each box has to have at least one file that's less than 75 years old. So we're just going to put the whole thing away under lock and key. We're going to say to access any of this, you need to talk to the Women's Prison Association. But it didn't include how you got in touch with them or who you even got in touch with or any of that kind of information. Again, it's 1980. The city had almost gone bankrupt a few years before. The libraries had almost shut down in the late 70s. So when the library knew they had this huge collection that no one was going to be able to access with specific permission, well, what was the point of writing a finding aid? That would take years of somebody's life to go through this and create a good finding aid, and nobody was going to be looking at it anyways. So they kept the collection, but now there's a collection that you need permission to access. It doesn't say how to get that permission, and you don't know what's inside of it. So no one ever accessed the collection, not ever. And I know because I contacted the Women's Prison Association for permission, and they said to me, no one has ever looked at these files except for a historian of our own organization. We don't know what you're going to find in there, but we don't think there will be any lesbians, any trans people, any queer stuff. We'd love it if you found it. We would love it. But we just don't think we were asking those questions in the 1930s. And I said to them the thing I say to everyone doing this research. You're probably right. You know better than I do. But could you please just let me look? Or please just tell me what you know. And inevitably, when I look, there's always something there. And in this case, it was an archive the likes of which I had never seen before. The very first day I sat down to do the case file research, I got a file that was like 300 pages long and followed a woman from her first arrest for hitchhiking in like 1929 all the way up to her what she did during World War II as a member of the Women's Land Army. And then even gave me some indications to be able to find out that she eventually ended up as a dog trainer in upstate New York, running a kennel in the 1960s, which is when she passed away. I had never seen anything like that for a working class, formerly incarcerated woman who did not end up somehow being famous. And I knew from that moment on that this was the archive from which I would be able to write this book. And then as I got into the archive, that enabled me to find so many more things because now I had the names of individuals. Once I had their names, I could find their census records. With their census records, I could find their school records, and I could find travel records, and I could find names of people who might have known them. And so that's how I started to find first person sources or first hand sources. I could talk to people who were still alive and to their partners and to their children. And so that group of files became everything.
How did you find the? Sorry, to those hearing in the background, there's a toddler who's very, very excited about a lot of stuff right now. Um, but how did you find? Hi.
Hi,
How? This is Casey, who will be assisting with the interview.
Casey.
How did you find the folks that you tracked down in terms of what they thought about someone coming in and writing this book, their willingness to talk to you and their comfort discussing what for a lot of people is a part of their personal history that they tend to keep pretty heavily under wraps, that and get pretty heavily stigmatized for.
It was hard and it was slow work. I mean, the hardest part initially is just that the prison closed in 71. So we're talking folks who were at least about 65, 66, 67 years old, almost all of whom had lived very difficult lives under difficult conditions. Very few lived to be in their 60s, let alone in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, which is what I needed for someone to have direct contact with the prison in earlier years. There were some of these folks out there, but they were difficult to find. Jay was the first one. Jay was giving tours of the West Village so that people knew about the House of D, right? So Jay was my starting place. After that, I started to ask really specific questions in order to find living people. For example, I found an article written by a law professor at Texas A&M. And in that, which was it was an article about women's rights, specifically among prisoners' rights litigation. And in that, there was a tiny note. And that note said that some of this had been gotten in an interview between the author, Professor Amber Baylor, who's really brilliant, and a woman named Carol Crooks, who had been the girlfriend of Afeni Shakur when she was incarcerated in the Women's House of Detention. And I was like, wait a second. Afeni Shakur, first off, a fascinating person who I need to know more about. Second, she had a girlfriend. That's not in her memoir. So I knew I had to talk to Carol. Talking to Carol was a long process. Carol is older, but was a phenomenally active person who the only way I had to get in touch with her was through her daughter. So I talked to her daughter probably once a month for 2 years. And then finally, the day after Christmas, she emailed me and said her mother was there. We could do the interview right now. And so that's how I interviewed Carol, which was one of the most important interviews in the book, hands down. Um, Unfortunately, like many, many, many of the people who I interviewed for the book, Carol died during COVID. I don't think that I could write the same book now that I did pre-COVID because so many people passed away. Some of the other ones, it was these incredibly long and weird pursuits. For instance, there was a woman who was arrested in the 1940s, I think for the first time, called Virginia, maybe it was 50s, no 40s, Virginia McManus. She was a New York City high school substitute teacher who was also a very high-end call girl on the side. After she was arrested, she ended up writing a book, and I read her autobiography, and I was like, this woman is a lesbian. This book is a book about a lesbian who went on to become a sex worker, but it was very lightly coded. Do you know? She would always talk about her roommate, but never mention how many bedrooms their apartments had, even when she told the whole layout of the apartment. So I was like, all right, who is this roommate? Can I find this mysterious woman named Anne? Took a long time. I found an unpublished memoir of a painter who'd known Virginia. In that memoir, he happened to mention the real name of her roommate, Anne. It was actually Nan McTeer. And I was able to track down Nan through a wedding announcement of hers in the 1960s, I believe, that had her maiden name. That gave me her married name. Her married name led me to a Facebook post where I was able to get in touch with her, and she told me all about how that man she had married had been a gay best friend who was a drag queen. It was a lavender marriage, how exciting their life was. It's a long story. And every single one of the people I interviewed was a similar long story. I talked to folks who had been activists with the Weather Underground. I talked to folks who had been involved with prisoner justice movements. I talked to folks who'd really never talked that much about their incarceration. I didn't talk to a ton of living folks who were incarcerated in the House of D just because there were very few of them to find. But since the book came out, more and more of them have contacted me, and I've actually been doing other interviews just as a I don't know. Something will happen with them someday. There'll be an archive that someone else can use, I hope.
So you mentioned here reformers and people who had worked in advocacy around prison industry, and you early on you write about coming into your book a reformist and leaving an abolitionist. Can you explain briefly what that difference looks like to you, and specifically why you see prison abolition as an issue fundamentally linked to queer liberation?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Big questions. Good ones. Here's the thing. I came in naive, uneducated about prisons. I think, like most of us, even many people who think of themselves as very educated, who read the news every day, we just don't know what happens inside of them. And we don't know what happens afterwards. And we don't know what has happened with them historically. And I say this as someone who has many incarcerated people in my family, who has had people, women coming out of the prison system, living with my family for years. These are folks, my cousins, I myself did not know as much as I should have. And the primary and most important thing I think that I did not fully understand that led me to believe that reform was even possible was how much, if you look at the history of prisons in America, you see that reform, it's at best a pipe dream, a temporary solution. It doesn't do very much. And what it does gets really quickly translated back into punishment, into more money for more prisons. We have these reforms that sweep in. We pay attention to this particular prison or that kind of issue, or even maybe prisons generally for a little while, and then we forget. And when we forget, everything goes right back to the baseline it was, because the truth is that prisons don't do what most of us think they do, right? They're not there to have anything to do with justice or rehabilitation. And that is even more true when you go back historically, but it's still true today. Instead, prisons exist because we have people we refuse to give any other kind of service to. And for those people, for those who are very poor, for those who do not have health care, particularly mental health care, for people who have drug use and other kinds of related issues, the truth is, our system has very little to offer them, and eventually they will do something that causes them to be considered arrestable, whether that is just being poor in public, like the homeless today with our new laws that we have given Eric Adams to treat them literally like trash and have them swept off the streets by the sanitation department, or whether that's because they are so frustrated that they scream in public and throw something. Eventually, these people are arrested, right? And that's when they go into the prison system. And the prison system does not rehabilitate them because we do not know what rehabilitation even is. We have done no research on it. We do not, what we know is things like having a job, having health care, having mental health care, not having a record that follows you for life. All of those things will help someone who has been formerly incarcerated, but we don't give them those things, right? That's not part of our plan. So for me, that was what really drove it home for me, was that every generation I saw reformists who were kind, well-intentioned, educated, and who said, no, 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 there's a way. There's a way we can make this prison work. We can make it kinder and gentler and softer and safer and pinker and nicer and more feminine. And they would get their way for a little while, and then it would all fall apart, and it would go back to being worse than it had been before. The example I like to use, historic example, is waywardism. Most folks don't know this, but the first laws in New York about being able to arrest children, wayward children, only applied to women. They didn't apply to boys. There was no such thing as waywardism for boys. The first laws from the late 1800s, and it was this. It said that if a girl between the ages of 16 and 21 had been arrested for prostitution and found guilty, and that she wanted help from the system, she could request assistance as a wayward young woman, right? So the initial law is this kind of reformist. It's there to help people who've been through the system and are now expressing, that they did wrong and they need the help. Within a few years, the law is completely eviscerated and changed. It becomes a law that now applies, I think, to women up to like the age of 25. They no longer need to have been arrested or incarcerated for prostitution, and they no longer need to be asking for help. Instead, now a wayward girl is any girl in danger of becoming a prostitute and or any girl whose parents say she's wayward. And if your parents say you're wayward, you could be put right into prison without any kind of trial, right? So this law originally intended to help people who have survived the system and who want the assistance of the system is very quickly transformed once the attention is no longer paid to these wayward girls into a blunt instrument to punish young women and bring more of them into the system. And this happens over and over and over again. And the reason that I say that this led me to believe that abolition and queer politics go hand in hand is that the things they both rest on are bodily autonomy, right? The right to do with your body what you will, whether that is to smoke or to be outside wearing pants or to not be held in a cage for decades, sometimes without even a trial. These kind of like minor things I think are where queer rights and abolition come together. And also this idea that this system is not capable of helping us, right? It wants to sometimes, or at least some people in it want it to, but it doesn't, and it can't, and it won't. And instead, when we strengthen the system, inevitably it turns itself back on us. I mean, there's a reason that 40% of the people incarcerated in women's facilities today are queer. It's because the system is still targeting us. And that goes back not just to adult facilities, but that 40% figure is true with youth facilities as well. So 40% of the young people in girls' facilities identify as LGBTQ at the point they're being incarcerated, and they are being tracked into a system that does not care about them and punishes them specifically for being queer, for being gender nonconforming, for being transmasculine and non-binary. It is a system that still revolves around femininity.
Okay, I'm going to ask you one more question and then we're going to jump to audience questions. But I want to get this one in because, in addition to the history of the House of D, the Women's House of Detention is a scathing indictment of the gentrification of queer history, and specifically the erasure of anyone who's not a cisgender upper middle class white man. Um, what changes would you like to see other historians and researchers make to further erode that paradigm?
A big one is what sources are we using, right? Like I go to sources that are hard. It took me a year, like I told you, to find these because it's really easy to look at a bunch of novels and say like, ah, that's what queer life was like in the 19th century. Do you know? It's really easy to look at the few usually very privileged people who we have records of being like semi-publicly or publicly queer in the 19th and early 20th centuries, right? Those people have a lot of privilege generally. The ability to do what they're doing comes along with all of this other stuff. So we have to look to other sources. We have to acknowledge other sources. And we constantly have to be questioning something like, if I'm only looking, say, at a group of white people, why is that? Is that a failure of my research? Or is there something about the historic space I'm researching that upheld white supremacy? And so I need to discuss that, right? Same thing with masculinity. Am I only finding male people, cis men, because of the sources I'm looking at? Or is it because of the place I'm investigating? And if it is because of the place I'm investigating, what does that mean? Right? This is not a neutral thing. History doesn't just happen. We have to look and say, like, why were these people in this place having this kind of movement? The other big thing for me is that, similar, going back to the sources, it's often very easy to look at the person who, say, founded the Mattachine Society, founded the Daughters of Bilitis. These are important early leaders. Absolutely. They matter. But if you even listen to their own words, what you hear from them is, oh yeah, well, I first started to get to know what it meant to be queer and be okay with myself by going to the bars. But generally they find the bars not political enough and then they go do all this other stuff. And I'm like, wait a second. We hail you as like, the person who started it all. But what you're saying is like, actually, I went to this bar where working class people were being out and were punished heavily for it. They were policed for it. They never got to have the kind of opportunity I had. And I went on to do all this stuff. And I often find myself wanting to know, well, who are those people, right? Who were the people you learned it from? Where did you get this? Those are things that I think we really need to be asking ourselves to broaden out what we look at as queer history, who we look at as queer people. and to not make assumptions about where we're going to find them.
All right, and I think that we're right on schedule for audience questions. So we've got actually three from one person. They're all great. So the first is whether you came across and thank you to Katie who's asking these. The first is whether you came across religious minorities in your research about the House of D.
Interesting question. Religion was not often touched on very deeply in the social work records. Most of them were some form of Jewish or Christian. There were a few atheists. I'm trying to think. I saw a couple files. No, I would say almost all some form of Christian or Jewish, few atheists. As we go later, as we get into kind of the Black Power movement, we start to see the emergence of like Islam and Islamic nationalism, but the social work records don't capture a lot of that. I almost think they did not want to ask about religion or they found it to be beyond their purview. But my favorite story when it comes down to like religious history and the Women's House of Detention is this. There's this social worker who comes in the 1960s to study what she calls the play family. She means queer relationships mostly, but and also like prison relationships, but mostly queer relationships. And she becomes obsessed with this strange fact. She's like, this prison is full of Black Jewish women. What's up with that? And so finally, one day she asks one of these women, one of these Black women who's wearing a Star of David, and the woman laughs and tells her that they're not Black and Jewish. They're actually what they call the Sammy Davis Club. And it's Black Christian women dating white Jewish women in the prison. And in the prison, you're only allowed one kind of jewelry. You can wear a cross or a Star of David. That's it. So, for Christian women, the Stars of David became jewelry in the prison that they were really excited to have. It was like this beautiful little thing. And so your Jewish girlfriend would give you her Star of David, and then you would wear that as your like femme piece of jewelry. They were not at all what this social worker thought she was seeing. It was, in fact, this like queer, religious relationship. It was like varsity pins, you know? So there is religion in the prison, right? And there are religious stories wedded throughout my history, but it's a very, very minor part of it. And folks who identified with, not the sort of major Abrahamic religions, they just are not recorded in the files, or if they are recorded, they don't say anything about their religions. Oh, I can't hear you, Jay. Sorry.
Right, mute button. This next one, and I'm very grateful for because this is one what I'd hope to ask and didn't have time for, which is were there stories that you came across that impacted you deeply but weren't ones you could include in your published work?
Yeah, there were. There were so many. Basically, the way that I do my work is like this. I tend to gather huge amounts of research, those kind of raw material, first-person accounts, get as close to it as I can. And as I gather that research, I lay it out in different forms, different views. So timelines, obviously, but also geographic ones. And I start to look for the trends that emerge from that huge pool of data. Once I start to see those general trends, then I go back into my research and I pull out the one or two individual people who I have the most information about so I can walk us through this in a really enfleshed way so that we can feel it, we can smell it, we can really remember it, right? So for every kind of like person in the book, they represent a big chunk of other people whose stories just weren't as well documented or didn't have the level of detail. So like every single person has like a couple of doppelgangers, I think of them. For instance, the person that I mentioned at the beginning, Charlotte, the one whose big file I found originally, she actually has this friend named Alice, and Alice has a very similar story to hers. Also a butch woman, also arrested at first for spending too much time with other women, doing these kind of like hitchhiking things. Also finds kind of her girlfriend, comes out, struggles with it. But Alice's life just wasn't quite as well documented. I couldn't find out what happened to her after about 1940, and all these other things. So Alice gets like a sentence or two. And there are a lot of people like that in the book. There's one woman who I did not get to put in there at all, and she had such a fascinating but small segment documented of her life. She was a very butch Black woman, also named Alice, interestingly enough, in the late 1960s. Who was one of the very, very few butch women who were active drug users who were receiving any kinds of services from these social work organizations in the 1960s. And in fact, reading her file, it's obvious that her social worker was kind of falling in love with her, but was also very threatened by her, seemed to construe her sort of like black queer masculinity, unrepentant masculinity, as both a threat and an attraction. She documents these weird meetings they have between the two of them, and then eventually she gets fired. And there's no real information about what happens there. And there's nothing else I can find about Alice aside from these, like, I don't know, maybe 40 pages worth of files. And I've always wondered what that story was like from Alice's point of view. Do you know, like, what she experienced with this social worker? And when that woman was fired, were they dating? Or was that woman exerting some kind of like undue power sexual dynamic over it? There's a lot of questions from that story. So many questions that I did not feel I could do any justice including it, because everything I told was going to be so partial that aside from like the bare facts of, I could say this social worker wrote that these things happened, but what does that get us, right? It just gives us an insight into that social worker's point of view. That's a story that's really stuck with me for a very long time, and I think is emblematic of the kinds of stories that do get pushed out, as you said, to the margins of history. It's a story of a working class black woman who was masculine, criminally involved, and an active drug user, right? We don't get a lot of these people's histories. So I'm always on like high alert when I find something because I hope it will lead me to more. Oh, sorry, muted.
God, I keep doing this.
No problem.
I'm. We've got one last question in the queue, and I'm encouraging the folks listening to send in questions because we've got a fair lot more time allotted for them, and I've got more that I can go to, but you'll come up with a wider range than I would.
Yeah, and I'm happy
So,
to answer any question. Truly, if there's anything on your mind, please ask me. And if for whatever reason you don't feel like asking it here or it occurs to you later, like I'm easy to reach. So yeah, anytime.
all right. So finally, and this you covered this a little bit, but I'd love to hear more about it. Katie asks, what pointers would you give to someone who wants to begin their own local LGBTQ plus archival research?
Hmm. Whew. Well, I would say the first thing to do is kind of like sense where it is you might go looking, right? I know of existing collections in my area, right? Thankfully, living in New York City, I know we have the LGBT Center in their archive. And I know that the New York Public Library has a big queer archive, sort of sprawling queer archive, honestly, in lots of different places. And I know the universities have them, but I certainly did not find the Women's Prison Association files until I was going really deep and looking for certain kinds of things. So I would start by just doing a sort of survey, like what is known to exist in your area, what kind of archives exist already, what kind of work has already been done, what has been published or podcasted or put in a film, who are the elders you can talk to. And by that I mean both like the queer elders, but also like the research elders, right? Who are the archivists, the librarians, who are the people who lead tours in your neighborhood. Like, get to know the other folks doing this work and meet up with them. We have a thing here in New York called the Queer Historians Meetup. The LGBT Center Archives runs it. It's once a month. It's phenomenal. It's a chance to sit down with folks, some of whom are undergrad students, some are grad students, some are independent researchers, some are archivists, some are just totally fascinated lay folks. It's a real group of people for whom history and queer history matters to them. And every time we talk, every person who comes in with a question gets 12 different other ideas about how to research it, where to look, who they should be talking to. And that kind of community, I think, really makes this work possible during the long periods where you don't find anything and you're not sure what the answer is. And everyone tells you there is no answer there and you can't publish that history and no one's going to be interested even if you did, right? You need the community to keep you going. I also think there are some things you can start to do just, from your home with very little other resources. Newspapers.com. It's a great website to look at history. It collects PDFs of newspapers from increasingly around the world, but mostly the US, going back into the early 1800s. And you can search for articles about your local life, your town, your city, your state. You can search for all different kinds of queer things. Often you'll need to know the words, right? This because the further back you go in history, the less they're going to share the same language, unless you're going to use those words to find the history that you need. But places like newspapers.com, Fold 3, which is the digital military archive, ancestry.com, all of these places, ProQuest, your local library might have subscriptions to them. Your university might have subscriptions to them. You may be able to start a free trial, or maybe for one reason or another, you already have an Ancestry account. Those are some places you can start doing this kind of research. The one thing I will say, digital research is really tempting. right? It's easy to do from home and it doesn't have a high barrier to entry, but it's deceptive in two ways. One, most things have not been digitized, particularly as you go further back. Very, 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 very few things have been digitized. And the ones that have been digitized, again, are the ones closest to power, right? They're the ones to be documents about people we already think are important, and that's why we digitize them. So it's going to skew you even further in that direction. And if you search something today, any database, even just Google, and you do it again a year from now, you will get new information. So, unlike going to an archive where you can talk to a librarian who can inform you if a new collection comes in, you do a Google search for a piece of information today, it doesn't exist. 6 months from now, you tell someone, oh, I searched for this, it doesn't exist. They Google it, they might find those records. So, digital research has to kind of constantly be updated. But it is a useful place to start. It's only a start, but it's a useful place to start. Those are a couple of my suggestions. The other thing I would say is to definitely read queer historians and read historians in general to see their methodologies. I love seeing how they work out problems, how they think about things, how they cast a net, and how they decide who fits in it. If you can talk to them, even better.
All right, we have another question. Thank you, Paula. So Paula asks, hi, I'm curious if there were stories you felt that you as a researcher could not ethically share, slash if you had created a set of ethical guidelines as you went through the archives to determine which stories you shared.
Yes and no. First off, I believe that there is no right to privacy once you are dead. Once you are dead, keeping your secrets is actually just upholding the same power structures that forced you to keep those things secret. It is projecting homophobia or racism or class oppression or misogyny into the future. Now, the changes when people are still alive. Everyone has a right to what their story is while they are alive. But once you are dead, you belong to history. And I only care in the sense of, do you have living people who may be affected by the telling of these stories? If not, I refuse to do the work of historical homophobia and carry that forward. Once you are dead, privacy does not exist in the same way. That does not mean, however, that we do not have an ethical relationship to the way we tell these stories. An ethical relationship to a subject in history is to meet them as a full person, to not cherry pick data from them that supports your thesis and ignore the rest of it, to not present them as only, in this case, say, a criminal, but to look at them as people with ideas and thoughts, to try and get as close to their beliefs about what they were experiencing, to hear it from their voice as much as you can, and then to represent that truthfully on the page. That's where we have to really do the work as historians of being ethical. We need to show them not as dumb versions of ourselves or someone who proves your thesis, but as humans and as full humans who are complicated and good and bad and in between. In terms of ethical stories that I felt I could not share, not a ton of stories. Though there were a couple of people who asked me not to share specific things, and I was like, yes, absolutely, I will not share those things. Good reasons. There were a few people who I could not determine that they had passed away, who I was pretty certain there was a chance they were alive, and so I did not include those stories. But the biggest one for me, the one that like it took me the longest to kind of ethically think through, was that when I started doing this research, I didn't think I would include any photos. And right away, the photos that I found were of prisons and incarcerated people that were really degrading and they weren't produced consensually. And I was like, all right, never going to include those. But as I got into the social work files, I started to find all of these women who had shared photos with their social workers that were beautiful and exciting or just interesting and showed me who they were. And I thought, oh, this is great. This is great. We're going to include a whole bunch of photos of folks who had been incarcerated, and we'll get to see them as they wanted to show themselves, and it's going to be so good. And then I realized, as I looked at them, that none of them were people of color. That, in fact, the only women that I could find pre about 1955 who were incarcerated and voluntarily shared a photo. Were white women. One black woman who had been arrested in the 1930s and shared a photo with a socialist newspaper. But that was it. And that photo had been digitized in the 80s onto microfilm. There was no original copy, and the digitization was so bad you could barely see her in the photo. And in that moment, I realized that what I was going to do if I published these photos, even though they were beautiful, even though they did give us some important information, even though they had been voluntarily shared by people who are now dead, it would give a very skewed perspective of who I was telling the story about. And I felt that that would actually bring the story in the wrong direction. A person who just flipped through the book would only see those photos. And the things that you would walk away from remembering, the people you'd be able to picture best would be the white women. And that they would become the ones that the book centered around just because they were the ones whose photos existed. And so I decided not to include any of them. That just felt like it was not the way to move forward with this book. I include a note at the beginning also of the book about language to try and deal with some of these questions. It explains how I address certain people in the text, whether that's by what label or what part or parts of their name that I use. Also, how and when I use words like women, cis, masculine, transmasculine. It felt important to give people a note on my language because then you, as the reader, can make the judgment about whether I've used it right or not. But at least you have in front of you a list of like, this is why I said what I said and how I said it. So those were kind of the big ethical decisions I think I tackled in writing the book.
Okay, we're out of audience questions, so I'm going to pull a few more out. What, I talked about sort of holes in research. What do you wish you'd been able to find more of? What,
Hmm.
what questions were you left with after writing this? Whether the questions that weren't filled by your research, or whether they're more global or thematic questions that just that writing the book led you to, or that reading the book might lead to people. But where does the train of thought that this book includes lead for you?
Well, because I was really dealing with the House of Detention, which existed from 29 to 74, the earlier part before that, the Women's Prison Association had a few records earlier than that, but not a ton, and I didn't look closely at them. I would be very interested in seeing the whatever kinds of records are being done with folks who were incarcerated in women's facilities prior to that. There's a lot of those in like Ohio. That's where some of the first women's justice centers were built, and so I just it would have been a very long process of research to go and find those records, and I could not do that in the time. And then the pandemic hit while I was writing it. So those are stories that I would really love to find to turn this clock even further back. A set of stories that I'm working on right now, actually, uh, I knew after doing this research that Greenwich Village was Greenwich Village as we know it today because of the Women's Court and the Women's House of Detention. But the files dealing with incarcerated folks, the ones I needed to write the book from, were not the ones that I could produce that argument from. They gave me a lot of evidence, but I needed to do a lot of other research before I could sort of write that story. So that's a different story that actually is going to come out with the website Gotham, which is a blog of the CUNY History Center. They're going to publish that probably in a couple of weeks. And so that was a story where I really needed to dig in and find more stories. And that's a place where I'm actually really interested in people doing more research. We have this like lazy idea that gentrification involves always a bunch of artists moving into a neighborhood, usually white, usually gay, and changing it. When I looked at what happened with Greenwich Village, that's not the story at all. In fact, there were institutional and administrative levels decisions being made by the city that starved certain neighborhoods and promoted other ones and moved certain kinds of people in and moved other kinds of people out. And yes, queer people are often in those stories in different ways, but it's a more complicated story. And watching the prison, which we think of as, a net bad generally today as being in your neighborhood, transform Greenwich Village into a bohemian wonderland and then eventually into like the shining beacon of gay rights in America by the time we get to the Stonewall riots. We need that kind of research. We need to look at what's actually happening when neighborhoods change. We need to look at what gentrification is and who is doing it and what it means. We need to look at how incarcerated people change the world. We often look at queer people, incarcerated people, poor people as being moved by history, but not being the ones who move the rest of us, right? And that's where I want to push us. I want to start looking at queer people, at people of color, at incarcerated people as people who make changes that change the rest of the world. So that's where I'd love to see more research done. That's very broad, high end. I also think, like every other women's prison, there's so much to be done about men's prisons, about Rikers. I think there is a fascinating story to be written about how the experience of incarceration in women's facilities and men's facilities was so different in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I mean, today too, but so different in that point that it actually produced different relationships to queerness and homosexuality and homophobia among different straight radicals. And that's, I think, an edge of things that we really have not looked at. There's a million things I think people should be researching, honestly. I should stop here because we do want to end eventually.
Do we?
Well, I have to eat dinner at some point.
Fair, fair. So I'm going to sort of turn around Paula's question and say you talk a lot about the invisibility of the incarcerated population in histories, in our movements, in our society. And I think that's an issue that's particularly relevant in New York City, where the physical isolation of our jails keeps them handily out of sight and mind. Like the Women's House of Detention was a cultural, created a cultural movement because it was accessible in ways
Mhm.
that RMS, the Rose M. Singer Center, isn't. That nothing on Rikers Island is. For those of you listening who are unfamiliar with this, with the structure of the New York carceral system, New York literally they no longer has a prison boat, but it literally has a convict island. That is where all of the city jails are, and which takes hours to get to, um, and which you can live your entire life in New York and never really have a physical location for, or never encounter casually. And I'm wondering, for people interested in looking and learning more here, delving into sort of this other intersecting invisible population, what would you recommend in terms of books and other resources?
Oh, this is always a question where I'm like, oh no, my brain has like totally fried. Have I read another book? Do I know what a resource is? Do I know the English language? It's terrible. One thing I really recommend, which is neither a book nor exactly a resource, but I think getting involved, again, just like I said, like if you want to study queer history, get involved with local historians. If you want to be thinking about these marginalized populations, organize with them and go to the places where they already are and they're already talking about their experiences. There are all kinds of places in New York City, the Women's Community Justice Association, also the Freedom Agenda. Also, there's like tons of people who are doing this work. Go and meet them and listen. Like that's the first thing is like go and listen and try to talk to them when they ask you questions and ask some questions, but mostly listen and read their publications, join their listservs, go to their events. There are a lot of books that I looked at in writing this book that have great things to say. Queer Injustice, I think is one that I really, really love. Uh, the autobiographies of many of the folks who were incarcerated in the prison, Angela Davis, Afeni Shakur, all those kind of radicals, look to those people today, who is still talking from a place of incarceration. Mumia, oh my God, his name just went out of my head because I am so tired. Mumia K. Jamal? Am I getting that right? My brain is so fried. Anyway, just released a statement on queer rights and his evolution in thinking over the long term of his incarceration as a political prisoner around queer stuff. Go read that, Go talk to the folks who are kind of producing this work today. That's, I think, my biggest recommendation. Did that answer your question?
It did, and I'm going to add one more actually because I thought of it as you were talking, which is the Rikers Public History Project, um,
Yes.
which is a series of interviews with people who've been incarcerated on Rikers Island, and which actually has a pop-up exhibit now. I don't recall where, but if you Google them, you'll be able to find it. That's just
Yeah,
like for the
there's
next, I think like a little chunk of this month.
oral histories are great. Go and listen to as many as you can. They're out there. Lots of universities have done them. They're all over the place, and you'll find all different kinds of ones. I listened to ones for this project that ones that were done in the 60s and 70s with female drug users in New York. Ones with folks who were diagnosed as HIV positive in the early 90s in Brooklyn. The New York City Trans Oral History Project. There's so many great oral history projects out there. Go get involved.
And with that, Hugh, thank you so much, both for the book and for this conversation. And I'm going to pass it back to Suhaili.
Yeah, thank you, Jay. Thank you, Saheli. Thank you, Lucy. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight.
Thank you both. This was such an incredible conversation. Go out and read this book if you haven't yet. Our partners at Reparations Book Club in LA offer a 10% discount to Lavender Literary Society members. So use the code Lavender10 to get your hands on this title. Our next book club session happens on December 9th. Please be sure to register. If you go to the American LGBTQ plus museum website, you'll see a little you'll toggle to the menu and you'll click book club, and then you'll see our upcoming book club on December 9th. We'll be reading LA Interchanges, A Brown and Queer Archival Memory by Lydia Otero. And that session will be hosted by Megan Solomon. So we look forward to seeing you then. Please stay tuned, follow us, as I said, on social media, subscribe to our monthly newsletter so you can see all of the wonderful events that are coming up at the museum. Have a great evening, everyone, and thanks again to Hugh and to Jay for this evening's conversation.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.